Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Tonight the question rises softly, like a flicker of candle flame in a dark room. Who was Aristotle, and why does his shadow still lie across every field of human knowledge? His life was a study in hunger, not the hunger of the body but of the mind, a restlessness that sought to catalogue, to classify, to understand the world in its smallest detail and its grandest structure. If Plato dreamed of eternal forms beyond this world, Aristotle bent his gaze down to the dust, to the roots, to the wings of insects, to the beating of hearts, to the laws that govern motion and growth. He was the philosopher who wanted to know everything. But how does a man come to such a life? He was born in 384 BCE in Stagira, a small town in northern Greece, far from the cultural centre of Athens. His father, Nicomachus, was a physician to the king of Macedon, which meant young Aristotle grew up not with myths but with medicine, not with poets but with healers who believed the body had patterns and causes that could be studied. Imagine a child not taught to worship Zeus but to examine wounds, to watch disease, to see life as a system of organs and balance. That seed of observation never left him. When he was 17, he travelled to Athens, the city still shimmering in the wake of Socrates and still echoing with Plato's voice. There he entered Plato's academy, the first great university in the West, and he remained there for 20 years, student and later teacher, absorbing the vision of a world beyond the senses, a heaven of pure forms. Yet Aristotle was restless. He admired his master but doubted him. Where Plato saw perfection beyond, Aristotle saw imperfection here and wanted to know why. He asked questions that seemed simple yet cut deep. Why do leaves fall? Why does fire rise? What makes a bird and not a fish? Why does a human desire happiness above all? Questions not of another world but of this one. In this he was like a quiet rebel, not with shouts or poison cups but with curiosity. He once said, "Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is the truth." That line is a wound and a declaration. It is the disciple refusing to be swallowed by the master. It is the moment philosophy becomes not worship, but inquiry. And so begins the irony of Aristotle. He was shaped by Plato, yet turned away from him. He inherited the academy, yet founded his own school. He studied forms, yet grounded himself in matter. This tension would define him forever. Consider how his life unfolded. When Plato died, Aristotle expected perhaps to inherit the academy, but the leadership went to another. Slighted, he left Athens and began to wander, first to Assos in Asia Minor, where he taught and studied biology, dissecting fish, tracing the veins of animals, observing embryos in the bellies of sharks. Imagine the philosopher with a knife, leaning over a table lit by oil lamps, charting the first crude maps of anatomy. From there he travelled to Lesbos, where the waters teemed with life, and his notebooks filled with observations of crabs, cuttlefish, eels. He was not yet the philosopher of logic and ethics, but the naturalist, the collector, the patient witness to patterns no one else thought worth recording. Jung might say, here we see the archetype of the scientist emerging, the drive to name and classify as a way of taming the chaos of life. Nietzsche, however, might scoff, seeing in this impulse the denial of flux, the attempt to pin life down, to fix what is always changing. Yet in Aristotle's hands, this was not denial, but wonder. To list the kinds of fish was to marvel at the abundance of form. To trace the stages of a chick in its egg was to glimpse life unfolding in order. It was not reduction, but reverence. Years later, he would be called back to Macedon, where he became tutor to a boy who would conquer the known world, Alexander, son of Philip, later called the Great. One can picture Aristotle walking in the gardens with the young prince, speaking not of power, but of ethics, not of conquest, but of virtue, instilling the idea that ruling is not only domination, but responsibility. Did Alexander listen? History is uncertain, but the image itself is haunting. the philosopher as teacher of an emperor, knowledge whispering into the ear of ambition. And yet this too is Aristotle's paradox. He shaped minds that would shape empires, but his own life remained that of a scholar, not a ruler. Eventually he returned to Athens and founded the Lyceum, his own school, a place where he and his students walked in shaded colonnades discussing logic, politics, rhetoric, physics, biology. They were called peripatetics, the walkers, because philosophy was not confined to a desk but unfolded in movement, in rhythm, step after step, thought after thought. Here his vision ripened. The dream not of a single system but of all knowledge unified, logic as its skeleton, observation as its flesh. He wrote of ethics, declaring that happiness is not pleasure, but the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. He wrote of politics, saying man is a political animal, incomplete without the city. He wrote of metaphysics, searching for causes and principles. He wrote of rhetoric, teaching how persuasion shapes belief. He wrote of poetry, analysing tragedy as a mirror of fear and pity. He wrote of physics, seeing motion as the pursuit of potential into actuality. He wrote of biology, classifying hundreds of species. No subject was too small, no question too vast. His pen touched everything, and perhaps that is why his life story feels uncanny. He was not a specialist, but a totalist. He wanted to hold the whole of reality in thought, and yet he was not free of fate. When Alexander died, Athens turned against Macedon, and as Aristotle had ties to the court, he was accused of impiety, the same charge that killed Socrates. But he fled, saying, as tradition records, that he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy. He died in exile in Chalcis in 322 BCE, leaving behind works that would become the foundation of Western thought. And so here we return to the question, who was Aristotle? He was the restless observer, the collector of truths, the man who sought order in chaos, the disciple who defied the master, the tutor of kings, the walker of colonnades, the exile who refused to be silenced. His philosophy, Aristotelianism, would shape logic for 2,000 years, dominate medieval science, and still echo today in the way we classify, argue, analyse. He was not merely a man, but a method, not merely a thinker, but a way of thinking that insists the world can be known, if only one looks closely enough. And perhaps that is the most hypnotic truth of all, that behind every fact we record, every category we draw, every explanation we give, Aristotle's shadow is still present, quietly reminding us that knowledge begins with wonder. Aristotle's logic was not just a tool, it was a revolution in how the human mind could discipline itself against confusion, against the slippery distortions of language and persuasion. Before him, thought wandered like a river without banks, swelling with rhetoric, bending with passion, easily turned by the force of a speaker's charisma. With Aristotle came structure, a skeleton for reason itself. He called it the organon, the instrument, and within it he carved out categories, propositions, syllogisms, the very grammar of rationality. What does this mean? It means he gave us a way to move from statement to conclusion with precision, to test arguments for validity rather than charm. Consider the syllogism. If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Simple, obvious, yet revolutionary, because it showed that truth could be built step by step, not left to intuition or authority. He gave us a system where knowledge could grow like architecture, stone upon stone. And yet there is something hypnotic, even eerie, about this. For in reducing thought to structure, he revealed the hidden machinery of persuasion and belief. To see logic is to see how easily the mind can be trapped or freed. If one premise is false, the whole structure collapses, and yet the conclusion can feel inevitable. This is why rhetoric and politics so often borrow the cloak of logic without wearing its bones. Nietzsche once mocked reason as merely the instinct of one species rationalized, and Jung suggested the unconscious will slip past the neat fences of syllogisms. But even they worked within the boundaries Aristotle drew. To argue against him is to use his very tools. Imagine Athens, filled with voices each claiming wisdom, sophists dazzling crowds with paradoxes, poets stirring hearts with verse. Into this noise, Aristotle laid down rules like a quiet carpenter, straightening beams, leveling surfaces, saying, "Here is how arguments stand, here is how they fall." He catalogued the types of fallacies, the tricks of language that sound true but conceal emptiness. He gave future generations a way to defend themselves against the seductive chaos of speech. Cicero used it to shape Roman law. Aquinas used it to bind theology with reason. Modern science, with its hypotheses and deductions, is still an Aristotelian child. And yet there is irony here, because Aristotle's own system, so precise, was bound also by his era's limits. He believed women colder in constitution, he misclassified species, he thought heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. His method was correct, his observations sometimes flawed, and here is the quiet lesson. Logic is not infallible, it is only as strong as the truths it rests upon. A perfectly valid syllogism can lead to nonsense if its foundations are wrong. And does this not mirror human life itself? A life built logically on false assumptions can feel solid until it collapses. How often does the human heart construct syllogisms in secret? If I succeed, I will be loved. If I am loved, I will be happy. Therefore, success brings happiness, only to find the conclusion crumbling. Logic is both salvation and danger. It orders the mind, but it cannot guarantee truth. Still, Aristotle's insistence on structure remains one of the most enduring gifts to human thought. For even when we reject his conclusions, we inherit his method. Modern computers, the algorithms that now shape lives invisibly, are born of Aristotelian logic, binary syllogisms running at impossible speed. The syllogism is no longer spoken by philosophers in colonnades but by machines in silence, deciding fates, guiding economies, predicting desires. Aristotle's shadow lingers even in technology, a man of the 4th century BCE, whispering still through circuits. Viktor Frankl might say that man is the only being who can take a position toward his conditions, and Aristotle gave us one way to do it: to order thought, to resist chaos, to give shape to questions. Yet the danger remains, for logic without soul can become tyranny of system, as when ideology dresses itself in rationality while hiding violence beneath. Aristotle knew this too, which is why he never left logic as a machine alone, but tied it back to ethics, to politics, to life. He wanted logic to be a tool of flourishing, not a cage, and perhaps this is why, despite flaws, his organon endures, because it gives structure not as prison, but as possibility, as scaffolding on which human thought can climb higher. The question then is haunting. Do we use it to climb toward truth, or to trap ourselves in illusions that sound inevitable? That choice is ours, and it always has been. Aristotle's knife against the skin of a fish, his eyes straining by lamplight, his hands tracing the veins of an embryo. This was not philosophy in the high air of abstraction. This was philosophy with blood and bone beneath its nails. Long before microscopes, long before laboratories, he knelt before the bodies of creatures and asked, "What is life, and how does it move?" In Lesbos, where the sea curled with strange and countless forms, he became a collector of wonders, cataloguing more than 500 species, watching cuttlefish change colour, charting the shells of mollusks, dissecting the stomachs of dolphins. His notes breathed with patience. He saw the beating hearts of embryos. He traced the differences between animals with red blood and those without. He named and divided, sorting chaos into order. And yet in his pursuit of classification, he revealed not only the life of creatures, but the life of human thought, the impulse to name, to divide, to categorize. Why does the mind crave lists? Why does it feel safer when the world is broken into boxes? Jung might call it the archetypal drive to impose order on chaos. Nietzsche might sneer that it is the refusal to embrace flux. Yet in Aristotle's hands, it was devotion, almost reverence. To name was to acknowledge, to describe was to honor. He called the soul the form of the body, inseparable from flesh yet animating it. Not a ghost within, but the pattern by which a living being organizes itself. Plants, he said, have nutritive souls. Animals have sensitive souls. Humans alone have rational souls. The hierarchy was not cruelty, but curiosity, a way of seeing continuity in the differences. Imagine the philosopher crouched on the shore, holding a crab, seeing in its twitching legs not strangeness, but kinship, another mode of life within the great order of being. His biology was imperfect. He believed men had more teeth than women. He thought the heart housed intelligence. But it was the beginning of science itself. The shift from myth to observation, from story to structure, to dissect a fish instead of inventing a god to explain it was a revolution. And the revolution persists. Every textbook that divides life into species, every evolutionary chart, every act of classification echoes Aristotle's knife. Modern biology has overturned his details, yet his impulse remains our foundation. The belief that careful observation can unveil the patterns of life. Viktor Frankl said man finds meaning not in pleasure, but in responsibility, and Aristotle embodied this by taking responsibility for truth, even in the slime of fish guts and the faint heartbeat of unborn chicks. There is something eerie in this devotion. The philosopher of ethics, of politics, of metaphysics, bent over dissected animals, as if to say that the highest truths begin with the lowest forms. And perhaps that is his lesson. To love wisdom is not to flee the world of matter, but to enter it deeply, to honour even the humblest creature with attention. He wrote that nature does nothing in vain, and this belief guided his eye. Every feather, every claw, every organ served a purpose, a teleology, a reason for being. Modern science is less certain, seeing chance and evolution, yet the allure of purpose remains strong, the sense that nothing is wasted, that life is patterned. And is this not what the human mind craves at night when silence falls? That there is meaning, that there is structure, that even suffering has place within a larger order. Aristotle's dissections were not only about animals, but about hope, the hope that nothing in existence is arbitrary. His notebooks passed into history, copied, preserved, influencing Galen, shaping medieval medicine, seeping into Aquinas, and still breathing in biology's language today. Even when he erred, he gave a framework. To classify is to begin the conversation. To err is to invite correction. Without Aristotle's first step, later truths might have had no ground to stand on. And here the irony deepens. Plato gazed upward to eternal forms. Aristotle gazed downward to mortal bodies. Yet both sought the same thing: order, truth, stability in a world of flux. The cave and the crab, the form and the flesh, two halves of a dialogue that has never ended. Aristotle's knife still gleams, not in his hand but in every scientist's scalpel, every biologist's lens. Every mind that believes the world yields meaning to patient eyes. And the question lingers in the dark. When he sliced open the body of a fish, was he searching for organs, or was he searching for himself? Aristotle's ethics begin with a whispering question that still unsettles every restless heart. What does it mean to live well, not for a day or an hour, but for a whole lifetime? He called it eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but it was not the happiness of fleeting pleasure, not the sugar rush of desire fulfilled. It was deeper, slower, a condition of the soul, in harmony with itself, a flourishing that endures through time. He watched men chase wealth, chase honor, chase power, and he saw how brittle these prizes were. Fortune could strip them away in a moment, and the man who had built his worth on them would collapse. To Aristotle, the good life could not depend on what the world gives or takes. It must be rooted in what cannot be stolen: character, virtue, the deliberate cultivation of excellence in thought and action. He said virtue is a habit, formed not in grand moments but in small choices, repeated until they shape the soul. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision, again and again, to stand firm. Temperance is not the hatred of pleasure, but the refusal to be enslaved by it. Justice is not a word, but the rhythm of fairness practiced daily. These habits form a middle path, a golden mean between extremes. Too much fear becomes cowardice. Too little becomes recklessness. Too much indulgence becomes gluttony. Too little becomes insensibility. Virtue is balance, and balance is difficult, requiring constant adjustment, like walking a tightrope with the wind shifting every moment. Nietzsche, centuries later, would rage against moderation, praising the excess of will, the overabundance of strength, but Aristotle saw the wisdom of stability. Life is long, and extremes burn out the flame. The mean preserves it. Yet there is something quietly radical here. For Aristotle did not believe virtue was a gift from the gods, nor the result of noble birth. It was crafted by practice, by education, by discipline. Anyone could cultivate it, and in this sense he was a democrat of character, even while living in a society bound by hierarchy and slavery. His ethics were both personal and political, for if man is a political animal, as he said, then no individual can flourish in isolation. The city exists for the good life, not merely for survival. Politics is not a struggle for power, but a shared project of cultivating virtue together. And here lies the tension, the irony. He taught that happiness is self-sufficiency, yet he knew no man is complete alone. He called friendship one of the highest goods, a mirror of the self in another, a testing ground of virtue. There are friendships of utility, of pleasure, and of virtue. Only the last endures, for it is based not on what one receives, but on mutual recognition of the good. To find such a friend, Aristotle said, is rare, almost like another self walking in the world. Consider how modern psychology echoes him. Studies show that meaning and long-term satisfaction arise less from wealth than from relationships, from bonds of trust and shared values. Viktor Frankl, in The Darkness of the Camps, wrote that man's search for meaning is what sustains him. Aristotle would have nodded. Without purpose, without virtue, life decays into chaos. And yet his ethics are not without shadows. He excluded women, he accepted slavery, his circle of flourishing was narrow by modern standards. But even here, the structure he built allows us to critique him with his own tools. If virtue is habit, then justice too can expand, recognizing dignity in places he failed to see it. His golden mean becomes not a fixed rule, but a method of reflection, one that survives its author's blind spots. What does it mean for us, centuries later? It means happiness is not a mood, but a practice. It is the quiet weaving of choices, the slow shaping of the soul, the refusal to be swayed by every gust of fortune. It is walking steadily, step by step, between extremes, building a life that is whole. And in the night, when silence asks whether life has meaning, Aristotle's voice drifts softly back. Look not at the pleasures you have tasted, nor the honours you have collected, but at the soul you have made. That is the measure of the good life, and nothing less will do. Aristotle looked at the city, the polis, not as an accident of history, but as the natural culmination of human life. Man, he said, is a political animal, and this phrase, so simple, so familiar, hides an unsettling depth. For what does it mean to say that politics is not a choice but a necessity? that to live outside the city is to be either beast or god, too savage or too self-sufficient to need others. In the polis, man discovers his completion, for only there can justice, law and virtue take root. Yet the city is not merely walls or streets, it is a community of speech. Logos, reason expressed in words, allows humans to deliberate about good and evil, just and unjust, useful and harmful. Without this dialogue, the city collapses into mere crowd, and the crowd collapses into mob. To Aristotle, the city is fragile, always teetering between order and chaos, harmony and tyranny. And is that not still true? How many states across centuries rise with promise only to decay into corruption, their ideals rusting like iron left in the rain? Aristotle observed constitutions as a naturalist observes species, classifying monarchies, aristocracies, polities, tyrannies, oligarchies, democracies. None perfect, all prone to distortion. A king may become a tyrant, the few may govern wisely or greedily, the many may deliberate or descend into demagoguery. His method was not to dream, as Plato did, of an ideal republic guarded by philosopher kings, but to study what actually existed, the flesh of real states, their failures and strengths. He was pragmatic, empirical, like a physician diagnosing constitutions instead of bodies. Nietzsche might laugh at the faith in balance, calling politics merely the masked struggle of wills to power, but Aristotle saw the need for structure to temper desire, for law to bind passion, for institutions to nurture virtue. Without the polis, man cannot fulfill his nature, and yet within the polis lies the danger of betrayal, of injustice institutionalized, of law itself becoming weapon. Aristotle's Athens had executed Socrates, after all, condemning the man who sought truth for corrupting the youth. The city is necessary, but it can devour its own. Here lies the paradox of human life. The individual cannot flourish without the community, yet the community can crush the individual. This tension has never vanished. In every age, the question recurs: how much must one surrender to live together? And how much can one resist before the city turns on its dissenter? Consider how modern psychology mirrors this. Studies of social behavior show humans conform to groups even against their own judgment. Solomon Asch revealed how people, shown a line clearly shorter, would still agree it was longer if the group declared it so. The polis demands conformity, but conformity distorts truth. Aristotle knew that without education, without virtue, the city rots. He believed law as a teacher, shaping citizens by habit, guiding them toward virtue. But he also knew laws can serve the few, corrupt the many, protect power rather than justice. His classifications remain eerily alive, for do we not still see democracies twisting into demagogies, oligarchies hiding behind wealth, monarchs masking tyranny with ceremony? His insistence that the polis is man's natural home remains both inspiring and unsettling, for it means loneliness is not simply a mood but a fracture of nature. Exile is not only displacement but mutilation, and justice is not private virtue but public necessity. Viktor Frankl might say that meaning is found in responsibility, and Aristotle's polis is precisely that, a network of responsibilities shared, where each citizen owes his being to others. And yet he excluded so many, women, slaves, foreigners, from this vision. His polis was narrow, its circle small, its justice partial. The modern heart recoils, yet the structure remains, a scaffold that can be widened, its principles stretched. Politics is still speech, still law, still the delicate weaving of justice and power. The question lingers: can the polis ever truly embrace all, or will it always define itself by exclusion? Aristotle's voice, calm and unhurried, seems to murmur back, man is incomplete without the city, but the city is never complete without justice. And so we walk the same tightrope he saw, balanced between belonging and betrayal, always political, always vulnerable, always searching for a polis that can hold the weight of human souls. Aristotle turned his attention to rhetoric, the strange alchemy of words that could bend belief, stir emotion, and move crowds to action. To him, rhetoric was not a cheap trick, nor merely the sophist's art of dazzling with language. It was the counterpart to dialectic, the necessary instrument for those who must persuade not philosophers in quiet debate, but citizens in noisy assemblies. He defined its modes: ethos, the character of the speaker that inspires trust; pathos, the stirring of emotion in the audience; logos, the structure of reason in the argument. Together, they form the triangle of persuasion, a geometry of speech still studied today. Cicero would later wield it in the Roman Forum. Martin Luther King Jr. would echo it in his dream. Politicians and advertisers twist it even now. What is strange is how little has changed. Human beings still believe the credible man more than the logical one, still follow the stirring of heart over the cold march of reason. Aristotle knew this, and he refused to dismiss it as weakness. He understood the psyche too deeply. Emotion is not the enemy of truth, it is the condition of being human. To persuade, one must speak to the whole person, not only to their syllogisms. And yet, there is danger here, for the same tools that can awaken justice can also enslave. The tyrant persuades as much as the liberator. The demagogue speaks with ethos and pathos, but the end is ruin. Aristotle catalogued fallacies, the ways language can deceive, but he also warned that rhetoric is inevitable. Better to understand it than to be its victim. Consider how modern psychology confirms his insight. The affect heuristic shows how emotions guide judgments more than data. Daniel Kahneman revealed how the mind is ruled by fast, intuitive thinking more than slow, rational thought. A charismatic voice can outweigh a sound argument. Nietzsche mocked truth as a mobile army of metaphors, suggesting that language itself is deception. But Aristotle treated it as a tool, imperfect but necessary. He sought to discipline it, to frame persuasion within the pursuit of virtue, not power alone. He wanted rhetoric to serve the police, not destroy it. Yet how fragile this hope seems when history is filled with speeches that stirred nations toward violence, propaganda that cloaked tyranny in noble words, and still, speeches that lifted the downtrodden, that ignited courage against oppression. Words are knives, and Aristotle handed us the handle, reminding us that they can cut to heal or to harm. His rhetoric is less a manual for manipulation than a mirror of the human mind. We are creatures who crave story more than syllogism, metaphor more than measurement. Even science, when it persuades, does so through narrative, through framing, through language that makes numbers sing. Aristotle knew this long before experiments confirmed it. Imagine him in the agora, listening to orators sway the crowd, noting their gestures, their tones, their timing, recording the anatomy of persuasion as a biologist records the organs of a fish. Calm, detached, yet aware that words were as vital to the life of the city as lungs to the body. And perhaps there is something unsettling here, for if every word carries power, then every silence carries risk. To speak is to shape reality. To remain silent is to let others shape it. Rhetoric, then, is not optional. It is the condition of being human together. Jung might say that beneath the words stir archetypes, symbols that awaken deep images in the collective unconscious. The leader's voice becomes father, mother, hero, shadow. Aristotle gave categories, but the mystery runs deeper. Still, his insistence remains timeless. Rhetoric is a tool, and like all tools, it requires virtue to guide it. Without virtue, it becomes poison. With it, it becomes medicine. And in this, his voice echoes quietly across centuries, a reminder that persuasion is not deception by nature, but potential waiting for direction. The question remains, who shapes the words that shape the world, and to what end? Aristotle entered the realm of metaphysics with a steady step, asking the most ancient and haunting question: what does it mean to be? His teacher Plato had dreamed of eternal forms, perfect realities beyond this world, but Aristotle refused to send truth into another sky. He insisted that being is not elsewhere, it is here, woven into the substance of things. Every oak, every stone, every human exists not as shadow of some otherworldly form, but as substance, composed of matter and form together. He called it hylomorphism, the union of what a thing is made of and the pattern that shapes it. Bronze becomes statue when given the shape of Apollo. Wood becomes house when ordered into beams and walls. Without matter, form cannot stand. Without form, matter is formless. This vision feels at once simple and profound. It anchors reality, pulling philosophy down from heaven into the soil. To understand the world is to see both the stuff and the structure, both clay and design. And yet his metaphysics did not stop at things. He probed change itself, the mystery of becoming. How can something move from what it is not to what it is? A seed is not yet a tree, yet within it lies the potential. He distinguished potentiality from actuality, a rhythm pulsing through all existence. The child is potentially an adult, the marble block potentially a statue, the student potentially a philosopher. Life itself is this dance of becoming actual, of realizing form. Nietzsche might scoff that being is flux with no hidden order. Heraclitus might whisper that all is fire, but Aristotle saw continuity, a teleology, the pull of purpose. Each thing strives toward its fulfillment, its entelechy, its completion. The acorn longs to be an oak, the eye to see, the human soul to reason. Whether this longing is inherent or illusion remains debated, but the elegance of the vision endures. It gave medieval thinkers a scaffold for faith. It shaped Aquinas' God as pure actuality, the unmoved mover, that which is fully real with no potential left unrealized. Aristotle's prime mover does not act like Zeus hurling bolts, but like the beloved drawing the lover, pure perfection, attracting without effort. It is less a god of intervention than a god of completion, the final cause of all motion, the reason why anything strives at all. Modern science may reject teleology, yet even physics wonders at order, at the strange precision of laws that seem tuned for life. And psychology too speaks of potential and fulfillment. Maslow's hierarchy of needs echoes Aristotle. From survival to safety, to love, to esteem, until finally self-actualization, the becoming of what one truly is. Viktor Frankl saw meaning as man's highest actualization, the pulling force that gives life coherence, even in suffering. Aristotle's metaphysics, calm and methodical, seems to breathe through these later insights. Yet there is something eerie in it too, for if all is potential striving for actuality, then every death is a story cut short, every life unfulfilled a contradiction of nature's pull. Does the seed that never becomes tree fail, or was its potential always conditional, fragile, subject to chance? Here the harmony trembles. Aristotle believed nature does nothing in vain, but we, watching the randomness of existence, feel the sting of wasted possibility. His system soothes, yet it also unsettles, for it tells us that within each of us lies a form unrealized, a potential waiting, a demand to become whole. The question that echoes is not abstract but personal. What is the form hidden within this matter? What actuality lies dormant in this life? And will it ever be fulfilled? Aristotle approached logic not as a game, but as the skeleton of thought, the hidden structure without which reason collapses into noise. He did not invent thinking, but he gave it shape, chiseling its patterns into something teachable, repeatable, almost mechanical. His syllogism, the small machine of reasoning, was simple yet powerful. If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. From two premises, a conclusion flows, not by chance but by necessity. It seems obvious now, even trivial, yet in its time it was a revelation, a way to catch thought in a net and show its bones. He gathered these patterns into the organon, a toolbox of logic, defining categories, predications, demonstrations. He sought not truth in itself, but the form of truth, the pathway by which the mind can travel without stumbling. In this he gave philosophy something it had not yet possessed, an instrument. Plato soared with images, Heraclitus spoke in riddles, but Aristotle built a framework, sober and precise, one that would dominate for 2,000 years. Medieval scholars would guard it like scripture. Universities would drill it into students. Theologians would wield it to prove God. Scientists to dissect nature. Even today, every structured argument, every mathematical proof, every algorithm owes something to that first skeleton he carved. And yet, beneath the rigor, there is something strange. For Aristotle knew that logic does not guarantee truth, only form. A syllogism may be valid and yet false if its premises are false. If all cats are immortal and Felix is a cat, then Felix is immortal. Perfectly valid, completely untrue. Logic, then, is a mirror of thought, but it cannot anchor reality by itself. It disciplines, it clarifies, but it does not save us from deception. And is that not the irony? The very tool that makes thought strong also reveals its fragility. Nietzsche once sneered that logic is merely grammar universalized, a reflection of human habits of speech mistaken for eternal law. Modern psychology too undermines Aristotle's calm architecture, showing how humans rarely reason syllogistically. Kahneman found that intuition, bias and shortcuts guide judgment more often than pure deduction. We are not Aristotelian machines, but chaotic bundles of emotion and instinct, stitched together by fragile strands of reason. And yet, Aristotle would not be surprised. He knew that logic was an instrument, not the whole of the soul. He treated it as the foundation, necessary but not sufficient. To live well requires virtue, to persuade requires rhetoric, to understand requires metaphysics, to live together requires politics. Logic supports, but does not replace them. Still, the ambition is hypnotic. Imagine the philosopher in his Lyceum, chalk in hand, sketching circles and lines, showing how thought moves, how one claim flows into another, how error can be caught like prey in a snare. He wanted clarity in a world full of contradiction, precision in a world swayed by emotion. The syllogism was his lantern against the night of confusion, and the lantern still glows, though dimly. Every scientific paper, every courtroom argument, every computer program whispers Aristotle's pattern. His logic was not perfect. He lacked symbolic notation, probability, the depths of modern mathematics. But he gave the seed. And seeds in Aristotle's world contain destinies. Logic was his seed, planted in the soil of human thought, and it has grown into forests of reasoning, some orderly, some wild, but all rooted in that first act of classification. There is something quietly humbling here, for the man who dissected fish and classified animals also dissected thought itself, carving its organs and showing their function. He asked, how do we know when our words match reality? And his answer was not mystical, but methodical. Build the structure, test the form, follow the syllogism. And in this method, philosophy became not just wonder, not just story, but system. And yet the system itself carries a haunting reminder. Logic can guide us, but it cannot make us wise. That step remains ours, fragile and trembling, always beyond the diagram. Aristotle turned his gaze to art, to poetry, to tragedy, and in doing so revealed that human beings are not only rational animals, but also creatures who hunger for stories. His Poetics is the earliest surviving work of dramatic theory, and it is astonishing in its calm dissection of what makes art work upon the soul. He claimed tragedy is not mere entertainment, not idle spectacle, but medicine. Through the evocation of pity and fear, it accomplishes catharsis, a cleansing, a purgation of emotion. The audience weeps for Oedipus, fears with Agamemnon, mourns with Antigone, and in this shared grief they are released. The paradox is unsettling. Pain produces relief, sorrow produces healing. Why would the human soul need to be purged by fiction? Why do we pay to suffer in the theatre, to watch blood and betrayal and loss? Aristotle's answer was quiet but profound. Because life itself is filled with terror and pity, and without art to process it, the soul would stagnate, swell with unresolved feeling. Tragedy orders emotion, gives form to chaos, lets us feel what cannot safely be lived. It is a mirror, but also a filter. Consider how modern psychology echoes this. Freud spoke of catharsis in therapy, the release of repressed emotion through expression. Jung saw myths and dramas as archetypal journeys of the collective unconscious, symbolic enactments of timeless struggles. Studies show that sad music can paradoxically increase mood, that horror films provide controlled fear which relieves anxiety. Aristotle glimpsed all this in the open-air theatre of Athens, long before laboratories measured dopamine and cortisol. He saw that art is not a luxury, but a necessity, a way for societies to purge and survive. Yet he was no mere romantic. He dissected art as he dissected animals, analysing its parts. A tragedy, he said, must have a beginning, middle, and end, a unity of action. Characters who are neither perfectly good nor perfectly evil, but flawed in ways that make their fall both inevitable and pitiable. The hero's hamartia, often mistranslated as tragic flaw, is not simply weakness but error, misjudgment, a blindness that leads to ruin. Oedipus does not fall because he is wicked, but because he cannot see the truth of his own life until it crushes him. This is why tragedy stirs us. It reflects our own errors, our own blindness, our own fragile fates. Nietzsche, centuries later, would revive the Greek tragedy in The Birth of Tragedy, speaking of the balance between Apollonian form and Dionysian frenzy, order and ecstasy. He mourned that modern culture had lost this depth, settling for shallow optimism. But Aristotle saw in tragedy a balance that endured, a structured chaos that heals. There is irony here too, for while he praised tragedy, he dismissed much of art as imitation, mimesis, a lesser shadow of reality. Plato had banished poets from his Republic, fearing their power to mislead, but Aristotle defended them. Imitation is natural, and through it we learn, we reflect, we grow. Children imitate to know, adults imitate to understand. Art is not falsehood, but revelation in disguise. And yet how dangerous that disguise can be. The same catharsis that frees can also numb, turning suffering into spectacle, reality into play. The theatre purges, but it can also addict. And in our time, tragedy is not only on the stage but on screens, in endless series of stories consumed not for cleansing, but for distraction. Does catharsis still heal? Or has it become noise, emotion spent without reflection? Aristotle would likely ask us to look carefully. What stories shape us? Do they train the soul toward virtue, or merely drain its energy? For in the end, tragedy, like rhetoric, like politics, is a tool, and its worth lies in how it shapes the soul. To be purged is not enough. One must be changed. The whisper of Aristotle lingers. Art is medicine, but medicine must be taken wisely. Aristotle bent low over the earth and the sea, studying creatures with the same seriousness he gave to politics and logic. For to him, all of nature was a vast book written in living ink. He observed fish, dissected octopuses, traced the beating of a heart, recorded the gestation of animals. His history of animals is not myth but method, a careful cataloguing of organs, instincts, and behaviours. He believed knowledge begins with observation, that to understand life, one must first look at life as it is, not as one wishes it to be. And so he described dolphins nursing their young, bees dancing in their hives, shellfish filtering water. He saw patterns, categories, hierarchies, the scala naturae, a ladder of beings stretching from plants to animals to man. Today, science finds errors in his notes, yet marvels at his ambition. He classified hundreds of species with no microscope, no genetics, only eyes and patience. He thought eels were born from mud, that the brain cooled the blood, but he also discovered the difference between warm-blooded and cold-blooded, saw that whales were mammals, that chicks developed step by step in the egg. His curiosity was relentless. In the Lyceum, his students walked with him as he taught by pointing at specimens, at leaves, at bones. Philosophy was not abstract clouds, but feather and flesh, scale and skeleton. This grounding in biology shaped his metaphysics and ethics. Life was form realized in matter, purpose unfolding in nature, teleology inscribed in every organ. The eye is for seeing, the fin for swimming, the seed for growing. He saw design everywhere, not as proof of a designer in the modern sense, but as evidence that nature does nothing in vain. And here lies both beauty and error. For we know now of accidents, mutations, blind processes that produce both marvel and monstrosity. Darwin would later break the teleology, showing that nature gropes without foresight, that the ladder is not planned but grown by chance and selection. Yet even Darwin admired Aristotle's depth of observation. He called him the greatest biological thinker of antiquity. And in a sense, Aristotle still speaks to us, for though we no longer believe in fixed essences or final causes, we still search for order, for patterns in the living world. Biology today still traces functions, still asks what an organ is for, still wonders at the balance of ecosystems. His error was thinking purpose was inherent, but his brilliance was seeing that to understand life is to see relation, function, order. Jung might say that Aristotle projected human meaning onto nature, reading purpose as if the cosmos itself were psyche, but even so, the act of seeing patterns is what allows science to advance. There is something haunting in his desire to catalogue all life, as if by naming and ordering he could bring the chaos of existence into human grasp. The same desire still drives databases, genomes, classifications. We still long to hold the diversity of life in the net of knowledge, though the net is always breaking, always too small. In Aristotle's world, each being had its fixed place, a chain of being descending from gods to minerals. In ours, the chain is broken, replaced by a tree with tangled branches, evolution twisting paths. Yet the impulse remains the same, to see life not as random dust but as ordered mystery. Perhaps this is why Aristotle's biology feels both ancient and intimate. It reminds us that science is born not in laboratories but in wonder, not in equations but in the quiet act of watching, of noticing. And so the philosopher who defined logic and politics bent over small creatures, and in their beating hearts he found philosophy still alive. Aristotle's ethics begin not with commandments from heaven nor abstract ideals of perfection, but with a simple and haunting question. What is the good life for a human being? He looked around at his fellow Athenians, at men chasing wealth, power, pleasure, honour, and he asked whether any of these could truly satisfy. His answer was both practical and profound. Every being, he said, has a function, and the good life is found in fulfilling that function well. The function of a lyre is to play music. The function of an eye is to see. The function of a knife is to cut. What, then, is the function of man? Not mere survival, not sensation. For animals share these. It is reason, the unique power to think, deliberate, and order life with awareness. Therefore, the good life is the life of reason in harmony with virtue. But what is virtue? Here Aristotle diverged from Plato, who dreamed of transcendent forms of justice and beauty. Aristotle insisted on earthliness. Virtue is not a distant ideal, but a habit, a practice, a cultivated state of character. One becomes just by doing just acts, brave by doing brave acts, temperate by restraining appetites. Ethics is not theory, but training. And yet the training follows a principle. Virtue is the mean between extremes, the golden mean. Courage lies between rashness and cowardice, generosity between prodigality and stinginess, temperance between indulgence and insensibility. The mean is not arithmetic, but relative to the person and circumstance. What is courageous for one may be reckless for another. What is temperate in wine for one may be excess for another. Thus, ethics is both universal and personal, balanced yet flexible. It is a system rooted in reality, as practical as it is philosophical. And here, psychology nods in agreement. Studies of behaviour confirm that habits form character, that repeated actions carve grooves in the mind until virtue or vice flows naturally. Neuroscience shows how plastic the brain is, how repetition strengthens pathways. Aristotle foresaw this when he said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence is not an act but a habit. Yet his ethics are not mere self-improvement. They are teleological. The goal is eudaimonia, often translated as happiness but closer to flourishing, a deep fulfillment of potential, a life lived in accordance with reason and virtue, in harmony with self and society. It is not fleeting pleasure, but lasting well-being, the soul at work in its highest function. Viktor Frankl would later echo this, saying meaning, not pleasure, sustains the soul even in suffering. Modern positive psychology too speaks of flourishing, of flow, of well-being beyond hedonism. Aristotle's vision still resonates, and yet it is not without shadows. His ethics presumes a stable polis, a world where citizens can practice virtue in leisure, where slavery and inequality remain unexamined. His flourishing was not for all but for the few. Here history judges him, and yet the core insight endures, that a good life is not accident but art, not given but cultivated. Nietzsche, rejecting morality, might sneer at the golden mean as mediocrity, preferring the excess of the Übermensch. And indeed, the mean can be misread as bland moderation. But Aristotle's mean is not mediocrity. It is precision, the exact right action in exact right measure. It requires judgment, wisdom, practical reason, what he called phronesis. This is why ethics cannot be reduced to rules. It is a craft, an art, like navigation on a shifting sea. The navigator does not follow a straight line, but adjusts constantly, guided by stars and winds. So too the virtuous man adjusts to circumstance, guided by reason and habit. There is something calming in this vision, but also something unsettling, for it tells us there is no final recipe for the good life, only the endless balancing of extremes, the fragile art of choosing well again and again. The golden mean is less a formula than a rhythm, a dance with circumstance. And the haunting question remains. In this life of choices, with all its temptations and fears, how often does one truly find the mean? And how often does one stumble into excess or deficiency, mistaking vice for virtue, comfort for flourishing? Aristotle spoke of friendship with a tenderness rare in philosophy, as if he knew that no system of ethics or politics could stand without the quiet glue of human bonds. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he devotes more words to friendship than to justice, for he saw that without friends, no one would choose to live, even if he possessed every other good. Wealth, honour, even virtue itself grow hollow in isolation. Friendship, he said, is one soul living in two bodies. Yet he was not naive. he distinguished carefully between kinds of friendship. The lowest are friendships of utility, where people associate for mutual advantage as traders, colleagues, or allies. Then come friendships of pleasure, born of delight in another's company, in laughter, youth, shared moments of joy. Both of these are fragile, dissolving when the benefit ends or the pleasure fades. But the highest, the rarest, is the friendship of virtue. This is when two souls love one another for the sake of the other's character, not for gain or delight, but because they see in the other a mirror of goodness. Such friendships are enduring because virtue itself is enduring. They grow slowly, require time, trust, habit. They are not many, for no one can be intimate with thousands. Yet they form the heart of a flourishing life, and here we hear echoes across centuries. Montaigne wrote of his bond with Etienne de la Boétie, a friendship so deep, he said, it was because it was him, because it was me. Nothing more, nothing less. Jung might say that true friendship reflects the individuation process, a resonance between souls striving toward wholeness. Nietzsche, in contrast, saw friendship as a form of rivalry, where the truest friend is also the truest spur, one who challenges, disturbs, pushes us beyond comfort. Even Freud, so suspicious of human bonds, admitted that love and friendship channel the forces of life against the pull of death. Modern psychology, too, affirms what Aristotle intuited. Studies show that deep friendships lengthen life, buffer stress, protect against illness. Loneliness, by contrast, is more deadly than smoking, more corrosive than obesity. The soul withers in isolation, and society pays the price. Yet Aristotle also saw danger. Friendship can corrupt if it binds people in vice, in shared injustice or indulgence. Not all bonds are virtuous. To love someone truly is to will their good, and that requires virtue in oneself. Thus, the highest friendship is both gift and task. It demands self-cultivation, honesty, patience. He even argued that a good man must love himself, not in vanity, but in virtue, for only then can he love another rightly. Self-love without virtue becomes selfishness, but self-love in virtue becomes the foundation of all affection. This subtlety is easily lost. Our age, hungry for connection, yet flooded with superficial ties, mirrors his lower friendships more than his higher. Social networks promise companionship, but deliver utility and pleasure, quick bonds that vanish with a swipe. The deep friendships he praised are rare, yet they remain possible, and when they exist, they shape destiny. Think of Kierkegaard, who wrote letters to his friends with fierce honesty, or Viktor Frankl, who survived the camps in part through bonds of meaning shared with others. Friendship, in Aristotle's vision, is not an ornament but a necessity, not an accident but a condition of flourishing. It is the bridge between solitude and society, between the self and the polis. And yet, like all things in his philosophy, it carries fragility. Friends die, betray, drift, bonds fade. To love deeply is to open to loss. But perhaps that is the final catharsis. In friendship we risk the wound of absence, because the presence is worth it. And so, as Aristotle whispered, without friends, no one would choose to live, even if they had all other goods. The truth is simple, tender, and quietly unsettling. Aristotle saw education not as the filling of a vessel, but the shaping of a soul. And in this belief, he linked the private household to the destiny of the city. A polis, he argued, is only as virtuous as the citizens it raises, and citizens are not born ready for reason or justice, but must be formed through habit, music, law, and learning. In his Politics, he declared that the greatest task of the legislator is education, for without it laws crumble and communities rot from within. He distinguished stages of growth, noting that children begin with senses and appetites, then slowly develop memory, imagination, and finally reason. To rush this process was folly, to neglect it was tragedy. He believed music and poetry should shape the emotions before abstract lessons train the mind. For harmony in sound leads to harmony in soul. Rhythm and melody, he said, sink deeply into the spirit, forming character long before arguments can persuade. How strange and modern this sounds, echoed by studies of childhood development, where music improves cognition, where stories shape empathy, where early environment molds the adult more than late instruction ever can. Aristotle urged balance. Education must train the body as well as the mind, discipline as well as delight, habit as well as reason. Excess makes tyrants of children, neglect makes slaves of them. He saw clearly what many still forget, that virtue is not taught by words alone, but by lived example, by repetition, by community. A child becomes brave, not by hearing speeches on courage, but by acting in small acts of courage, guided by elders. And so he placed great weight on imitation, on the power of role models. Here modern psychology nods once again. Bandura's experiments showed how children imitate aggressive behavior simply by watching adults, even without reward. The lesson is eerie. Virtue and vice flow silently from example, shaping character without consent. Aristotle knew this long before psychology named it, and so he insisted that education must not be left to chance or to the whims of families, but must be guided by the state, for the fate of the city depends on it. Yet he also feared indoctrination. He wanted education to form free men, not obedient machines. His vision was not of standardization, but of cultivation, each soul guided toward its telos, its fulfillment as rational and virtuous. He imagined an education that balanced grammar, music, gymnastics, philosophy, politics, preparing citizens for both contemplation and action. Still, his world was limited. His education was for free men, not for women, not for slaves, not for the many excluded from the polis. In this, his system carries shadows, the blind spots of his time. Yet the principle remains radiant, that education is the foundation of the good life, the bridge between individual and society, the craft that molds possibility into actuality. Nietzsche, skeptical of mass education, warned that systems often produce mediocrity rather than greatness. Yet even he admitted that culture depends on how the young are formed. Viktor Frankl, reflecting on the camps, said that meaning must be taught, not given, that the soul can be trained to endure by cultivating purpose. Aristotle's insight whispers beneath these voices. For if the city forgets education, it forgets itself. And if the soul forgets education, it forgets its own possibility. There is something both hopeful and haunting in this vision. Hopeful because it means character can be cultivated. Haunting because it means corruption can be cultivated too, and a single generation neglected may doom a city. Education for Aristotle is both promise and peril, the most fragile and the most powerful tool of human life. Aristotle declared that man is by nature a political animal, and with this simple phrase he revealed both the necessity and the fragility of human life. For no individual, he argued, can achieve fulfillment alone. The household provides survival, the village offers stability, but only the polis, the city-state, allows the flowering of virtue and the pursuit of the good life. To live outside the polis by choice is either to be a beast or a god, for man belongs to the middle realm where cooperation is the condition of flourishing. Yet Aristotle was no utopian dreamer. Unlike Plato, who sketched an ideal republic ruled by philosopher kings, Aristotle studied constitutions as a botanist studies plants. He collected reports of 158 city-states, dissected their laws, weighed their strengths and weaknesses, and concluded that no single form is perfect, but each must be judged by whether it fosters the virtue of its citizens. He classified governments by who rules and for whose benefit. Monarchy, aristocracy, and polity when just, tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule when corrupt. The distinction was not the name but the purpose. A ruler who governs for himself becomes a tyrant. A few who rule for wealth become an oligarchy. The many who seize without justice become a mob. But when power is directed toward the common good, monarchy becomes noble, aristocracy honourable, democracy balanced. Yet Aristotle favoured moderation. The best constitution, he argued, was one with a strong middle class, for extremes breed instability. The poor envy, the rich oppress, but the middle steers steady. His words echo eerily today, when societies fracture under inequality, when the disappearance of a middle class weakens democracies. Modern political science still affirms what Aristotle sensed. Stability flows not from force but from balance. He also saw politics as moral education in disguise. Laws, he said, are habits written in stone. They train citizens in virtue by making good acts easier, bad acts harder. To live under law is not to lose freedom but to shape it, to align personal desire with the rhythm of the city. Here he foreshadowed thinkers like Rousseau, who saw the social contract as forming a general will, or Durkheim, who saw law as moral glue. Yet Aristotle also carried the shadows of his time. He defended slavery as natural, limited citizenship to free men, excluded women from political life. His vision of the polis was luminous yet narrow, a circle of virtue drawn too small. Still, the principle glows that politics is not mere power struggle, but the architecture of human flourishing. Nietzsche might mock this as herd morality, the submission of the strong to the many, while Hobbes would later counter that man outside the state is a wolf, requiring Leviathan to keep peace. Aristotle offered a gentler balance. Man is not wolf alone, nor sheep alone, but citizen, capable of virtue through community. And yet the haunting irony is that politics so often fails to cultivate virtue, breeding division instead. Aristotle knew this. He warned that factions destroy states, that corruption of law leads to tyranny, that the decay of friendship between citizens dissolves the very glue of the polis. And so he offered not an ideal, but a fragile art, politics as navigation, always adjusting, always balancing extremes. There is something hypnotic in this vision. To live politically is to weave oneself into a fabric larger than one's own threads, to accept that flourishing is not solitary, but shared. And the question that lingers is quietly unsettling. If man is by nature political, what becomes of him when politics decays, when the polis fractures, when laws corrode? Does he become beast, or does he attempt to play God, reaching for power beyond measure? In this tension, Aristotle leaves us still searching. Aristotle ended his ethics and politics with a turn towards something quieter, higher, almost divine, contemplation or theoria. After examining virtue, friendship, justice, and the fragile art of living together, he asked what the highest life might be, the life most fitting to the human function. And his answer was startling. Beyond the active life of politics and the balanced life of virtue, he placed the contemplative life, the life of the mind turned toward truth. For if the function of man is reason, then the highest exercise of reason is not in choosing means or shaping laws, but in contemplating what is eternal, unchanging, necessary. Practical wisdom guides the city, moral virtue steadies the heart, but contemplation touches the divine. He spoke of it almost with reverence. In contemplation, the soul becomes self-sufficient, needing little, distracted by nothing, resting in truth. It is the closest a mortal can come to immortality, for in thought we share in what is beyond decay. To live such a life is rare, difficult, requiring leisure, education, freedom from necessity. It was the privilege of philosophers, of a few. Yet Aristotle did not dismiss the active life. He admitted that most cannot live only in contemplation, that politics and virtue remain necessary. Still, he insisted that contemplation crowns them, as the summit crowns the mountain. Without it, the good life remains incomplete. And here he differs sharply from his teacher Plato. Plato saw contemplation as ascent to the forms, escape from the cave of shadows. Aristotle grounded it not in otherworldly forms but in the study of nature, of logic, of causes. His contemplation is not escape but attention, not transcendence but deep seeing. He found the eternal not above the world, but within its order, its laws, its patterns. This is why his works range so wide: biology, physics, rhetoric, metaphysics. To contemplate was to uncover the order already woven into reality. Theoria for Aristotle was not idle speculation, but the deepest act of living. And yet, is there not irony here too? For Aristotle, who catalogued fish, debated constitutions, tutored Alexander the Great, who lived in the messy fabric of Athens, still placed the highest life in the stillness of thought. Perhaps he knew too well the turmoil of politics, the fragility of friendships, the corruption of power. In contemplation, he found a refuge, a vision of life untouched by fortune. And yet, even this life is fragile, for leisure itself depends on society, on peace, on conditions few attain. His vision is both inspiring and unsettling. Inspiring because it elevates the life of the mind, unsettling because it leaves most outside its reach. Nietzsche would sneer that contemplation is escape, that the will to power, not theoria, defines life. Frankl would counter that meaning is found not only in thought but in action, in suffering endured. Jung would suggest that contemplation without integration of the shadow is mere illusion, and yet Aristotle's vision endures. Universities, libraries, quiet studies all carry his whisper that the mind in contemplation touches something eternal. Modern science too, though different in method, embodies this drive, to know not for use alone, but for truth itself. And perhaps that is why his closing vision feels both ancient and intimate. For who has not felt, even briefly, the strange stillness of thought at its purest? Reading under candlelight, gazing at stars, tracing patterns in history, moments when the mind forgets hunger and fear and rests in wonder. These moments are rare, fragile, yet they carry the taste of eternity. Aristotle's life ended in exile, accused of impiety, fleeing Athens to spare it another trial of philosophy. He died not in a temple, but in a farmhouse. Yet his vision outlived him, carried in manuscripts across centuries, whispering still. The highest human life is not conquest, not wealth, not even virtue alone, but contemplation, the turning of the mind toward what does not die. The story just told has now come to its close, a thread gently tied, its images and ideas already sinking into the quieter layers of thought. Yet for those whose minds still drift wakefully, another story begins, one drawn from the ancient words of Lao Tzu, the sage of the Tao, whose voice, though separated from us by centuries, still flows like a river through the valleys of time. In the Tao Te Ching, among its spare and winding verses, lies a paradox both delicate and immense, that the softest thing in the world, water, can overcome the hardest. The line is simple, almost small enough to miss, yet it holds the weight of a truth seen through long observation. Water yielding to every shape, bending without resistance, never grasping or striking, wears down stone, slips past obstacles, finds its way where nothing else can pass. To Lao Tzu, this was not a mere observation of nature, but a mirror held to the nature of life, a lesson in patience, resilience, and the quiet strength of what does not contend. The world is full of hardness, rigid thoughts, fixed wills, walls built against change. These, like stone, seem unshakable. Yet water, soft and persistent, seeps into every crack, moves without hurry, and in time reshapes the unmovable. It wins not through force, but through its refusal to be forced. In the stillness of night, one might hear the faint trickle of a stream, or recall the sound of rain against the earth, and know in that sound the presence of something that does not fight, yet cannot be stopped. Lao Tzu's teaching is not a call to weakness, but to a strength that appears in the form of yielding, to a wisdom that sees the futility of rigid struggle, and instead flows around the obstacle, patient enough to wait for the moment when the obstacle itself is changed. Just as water is clear and without fixed form, so the mind freed from clinging can move through the hardness of life without breaking. This is not the strength of a clenched fist, but the strength of open hands, not the shout, but the quiet persistence that endures beyond the noise. In this way, the soft can overcome the hard, and the gentle can master the unyielding, not by defiance, but by a deeper accord with the way of things. In the landscapes Lao Tzu knew, rivers carved valleys over centuries, rain polished mountains into rounded hills, and the sea, without rising in anger, swallowed stone cliffs grain by grain. He saw in these quiet movements a way of being that did not exhaust itself in battles for control. Water never seeks to dominate the stone, yet in the patient arithmetic of time, the stone changes and the water remains. To grasp this is to see that strength does not always declare itself loudly. A rigid branch may snap in the storm, but the reed bends and survives. In human life, hardness often appears as stubborn will, the refusal to yield an inch, the insistence on victory by direct confrontation. This can win a day, a year, even a decade, but like the stone, it must eventually meet something it cannot break. Softness, by contrast, can seem like loss, like giving way, yet when it is guided by purpose, it becomes a force the hard cannot resist. To yield is not to surrender one's nature, it is to preserve it so that it may continue to act. Lao Tzu's water is not passive, for it moves ceaselessly, shaping the course of its own path. It does not cling to the bank it leaves behind, nor resist the turn ahead. It teaches that resilience is not the same as resistance, and that survival often belongs to what can transform without losing itself. In the human mind, water's way becomes a discipline of letting go, of refusing the tightness that closes off new routes, of trusting that forward movement can happen without force. It asks for trust in the unseen work of time, for faith that slow change is still change. In the candle's soft light, one can imagine the long patience of water in a world of stone, moving where there is space, waiting where there is not, knowing that nothing hard can stand forever against what flows without end. The candle gutters and steadies, the room breathing with a small hush of night air, while the mind turns again to the old pages where water is praised for going to the places others avoid. Low, quiet, unclaimed, useful to all and rival to none. Lao Tzu, a figure hovering at the edge of history, perhaps 6th century before the Common Era, perhaps later, a librarian or a recluse or a road traveller who handed a border guard the verses before vanishing, speaks through the compact brightness of the Tao Te Ching, where the highest goodness is likened to water, because it nourishes without demanding, because it does not contend, because it flows to the valley where pride does not dwell. What does it mean to go low and yet to rise? What does it mean to be soft and yet to overcome? A river answers without speech, shaping stone by patience, widening its banks not by decree but by return, again and again, until resistance becomes a curve and not a wall. The sage reads the river as others read a law code, tracing the clauses of motion in every bend, learning that timing is a deeper strength than force, that placement is a subtler power than pressure. A leader who stands above becomes a peak that the clouds pass without touching, but a leader who stands below becomes the sea, gathering all streams, directing without the roughness of command, governing by yielding, receiving by lowering, guiding by being guided. How can one be guided while guiding, and yet not lose direction? The answer moves like silt falling through clear water after the splash is done, a slow settling that reveals the riverbed again, the shape that was there all along only hidden by turbulence. In the text, the way is not a plan, but a path already present, the current already moving. The art lies in feeling how to float within it, when to paddle, when to drift, when to slip sideways into a smaller channel that avoids the fallen tree. Water keeps no hard memory of the rock it met at dawn. It continues. It takes the next line of least resistance, not from fear, but from clarity, not from weakness, but from the recognition that the goal is distance, not drama. The body understands this teaching before the tongue can phrase it, for blood remembers its rounds. Lymph makes its silent passages. Tears come and go with their salt, and each breath arrives like a small tide that gathers what must be released and leaves what must remain. The mind which loves to strike can instead dissolve, letting a knot loosen by absence of pulling, letting a word emerge when it has ripened rather than when a moment demands a show of strength. What is a knot to water but a pattern that will unmake itself, if soaked long enough, if left in the patient bath of attention? In the cliffside temple courtyards of memory, the rain falls for ages on bronze bells and tiled eaves, and the patina that forms is not a wound but a blessing, a softening that time writes as praise for what endures without shouting. The sage watches a torrent and a trickle and sees the same principle. That flow is invincible because it refuses to become a single hard shape, because change is not its enemy but its native tongue. Why chase confrontation when redirection will do? Why push a door inward when it will open outward for a lighter hand? Why harden a face when a pause will cool the heat and make the right sentence possible? The stone speaks only in weight, the water speaks in roots, and roots win. To live as water lives is not to resign, it is to reserve energy for what requires it. To avoid paying the cost of pride for small victories that soon become large regrets, to attend to the landscape rather than the score. The text praises emptiness, not as lack but as capacity. The cup useful because it is hollow. The room useful because it holds unfilled air. The valley rich because it receives what the mountain sheds. The sea lord of streams because it is lower than all. What is low but a promise to carry? What is empty but a promise to welcome? In the palace of strategies, this is scandalous counsel, yet history confirms it quietly, for empires that stiffen break on their own corners, while customs that bend with new times endure like reed mats renewed with each season, altered yet the same. The lesson hides in ordinary hours. A pot over flames that are too fierce cracks, a pot over steady coals cooks through. A letter sent in, anger becomes a sharp pebble in the shoe of years. A letter sent after sleep becomes a clear path, seen in morning light. A schedule packed to its lips spills. A schedule with a hollow at its centre becomes a basin that catches what chance pours in. Water does not think of winning, yet it arrives. It does not promise, yet it keeps going. It does not declare, yet it shapes. Is there a gentler power? The page closes and opens again in the mind, and the small candle offers a living commentary, for the flame achieves its task by consuming itself at a pace that does not rush, for haste would be the speed of loss, while measure is the rhythm of service. Patience is not delay for its own sake. It is alignment with what can be done now, and what must be done by hours that have not yet arrived. It is the wisdom to let time work alongside effort, so that effort is not alone. Resilience is not a helmet. It is a spring, not a wall. It is a curve that returns to form after strain. It is a way of continuing that does not require defiance to prove itself. The night listens as the thought finishes its circle. The sage remains elsewhere, or everywhere, saying almost nothing, asking whether hardness truly secures what it tries to protect, inviting the experiment of softness practiced long enough to become unanswerable. A last question ripples through the quiet. When stone is remembered centuries from now, will the memory be the crack or the curve the water left behind? And which of these tells the truer story of strength? Night settles more deeply, and the mind drifts with it, carrying the image of a river through darkness, silvered under moonlight, moving without hurry toward a destination unseen. Lao Tzu's image of water is not a metaphor invented for comfort, but an observation repeated through the centuries, a truth that belongs to the earth as much as to the text. Water is the master of adaptation. It takes the shape of the cup without argument, fills the hollow of the land without condition, and yet, over seasons and centuries, it sculpts entire continents. In the Tao Te Ching, it is written that nothing in the world is softer than water, yet nothing is better at overcoming the hard. The paradox is real because it refuses the usual meaning of strength. In the human mind, strength is often imagined as dominance, the ability to force one's will upon others or upon circumstance, but water teaches that lasting influence comes not from domination, but from endurance, from the quiet persistence that outlives the momentary blaze of force. Watch the river in flood, and you see its temporary violence, but watch it in its ordinary state, and you see its true nature, patient, unceasing, willing to travel the long road rather than claim an immediate victory. To live as water lives is to accept that the world resists the straight line. Rocks will rise, banks will narrow, fallen branches will block the way, and the impatient will turn to frustration. But water turns to finding another path. It curves where it must curve. It pauses in pools where it must rest. It even retreats when the tide draws it back, trusting that it will return again. This is not resignation. It is the wisdom of knowing that the goal is not to win today, but to keep moving for as long as there is movement to make. The sage observing this learns to measure time not in days or hours, but in seasons and cycles. An insult received may be answered in silence, not from weakness, but because the answer is already being shaped by patience. A setback may be met with a change in direction rather than a collision with the obstacle. To be soft in this way is to place faith in transformation rather than in confrontation. The stone, after all, is unchanged after the first drop of rain, and perhaps even after 100, but in the length of years it is worn smooth, its edges rounded, its face carved. Water has no memory for revenge, but it remembers its purpose. In the same way, the mind that flows with the Tao does not hoard bitterness or pride. It holds to its direction and allows the rest to dissolve. And there is another layer to water's strength, its humility. It seeks the lowest places. It does not rush to the heights but flows down into the valleys, into the shadowed hollows where others will not go. In this humility, it gathers all the streams, uniting them into a greater whole. The sea, said Lao Tzu, is king of the 100 streams because it lies below them. This is not the humility of self-erasure, but the humility of inclusion, the kind that creates space for others to join without fear. Those who wish to lead without force can learn here, to lead like the sea, by receiving, by making room, by letting others flow toward you rather than pushing them from behind. There is a peace in this, and a power. One can see it in the way water reflects without holding, mirrors without judgment, carries without ownership. The sky may pass across it in clouds or in stars, and water holds both images in turn, never confusing them with itself. A person who can be like this, clear enough to reflect yet calm enough not to cling, becomes as untouchable as the river's heart, for they cannot be disturbed beyond the ripples that fade in their own time. It is easy to admire the torrent, the waterfall, the dramatic rush of water over a precipice, but Lao Tzu's teaching is to admire also the unseen work of water, the slow seep into stone, the hidden flow beneath the soil, the quiet accumulation of drops that will one day wear a channel through the hardest ground. In the long night, as the candle burns lower, this truth feels close. Strength is not the clenched jaw, the raised voice, the unyielding demand. Strength is the silent shaping, the slow approach, the resilience that does not announce itself, but is found still flowing when everything else has stopped. And so the river moves on, and so should the heart. The night deepens, and the quiet becomes a vast plain, unbroken except for the steady pulse of thought moving like a hidden stream under the surface. The mind returns to Lao Tzu's image, that nothing is softer than water, and yet it conquers the unyielding. To feel this is to see the distinction between speed and duration, between the sharpness of a moment and the depth of a lifetime. A blade can cut once and then dull. A hammer can strike and then rest. But water moves without ceasing, and its ceaselessness is its edge. The Tao Te Ching does not speak of victory in the language of battles, but in the language of seasons. It trusts what is repeated over time more than what is imposed in an instant. The heart of this wisdom is patience, not the patience of waiting passively, but the patience of acting in alignment with the rhythms of the world, knowing that resistance consumes itself faster than endurance does. The river does not push the boulder head-on, for that would only exhaust its force in a single, futile moment. Instead, it slides past, finding the spaces, wearing the edges, until the stone is no longer an obstacle, but part of the path. It is a truth both simple and difficult, to remain in motion without clinging to the need to arrive, to understand that the journey is not the means to an end, but the end itself unfolding in each bend, each ripple. To live like water is to accept the shape the moment offers without becoming trapped by it. When a vessel is narrow, water becomes narrow. When a basin is wide, water spreads without resistance. In human life, this is the art of adjusting without losing essence, of bending without breaking, of being shaped by circumstance, while still carrying forward the same quiet direction. Many fear that such yielding is a kind of defeat, but it is in truth the avoidance of unnecessary loss. For what is lost in rigidity cannot be regained, but what is preserved through flexibility may be used again and again. Water also teaches humility, the choice to seek the low ground, the willingness to go where others will not go, not because it lacks ambition, but because it understands that the low ground receives all streams. This is the humility of listening more than speaking, of absorbing rather than resisting, of learning without the armor of pride. In leadership, it is the humility that unites, for those who would be followed must first make space for others to come to them. Lao Tzu saw the sea as the great master, because it lies beneath the rivers, allowing them to flow into it freely. This is a leadership without force, a gathering of strength through reception rather than through demand. In relationships, the waterway is the choice to hold without gripping, to offer space without absence, to reflect without distortion. Water mirrors the sky without keeping its image. So too can one receive the words, the emotions, the presence of another without turning them into possessions. This is a rare kind of strength, for it cannot be taken by threat nor diminished by insult. And water's lesson is not only in movement, but in stillness. A river flows, yet there are moments when it pools into deep quiet, the surface smooth as glass, holding the world's image without a sound. Such stillness is not the absence of life, but its concentration, a readiness to move again when the time is right. In the same way, there are seasons in which the wise do not press forward, but rest, gather, and deepen. Stillness allows clarity to return. It lets the silt of confusion settle so the bottom can be seen again. In the rush to act, many lose their way, but in the pause, the next step often reveals itself without effort. Water also accepts transformation without fear. It becomes vapor in the sun's warmth, mist in the morning cool, ice in the mountain shadow, and returns again to liquid without clinging to any state as final. This is the great teaching for a human life, to change form when change is needed, without resisting the return to a previous form when the time calls for it. Nothing in water says permanence is the measure of truth. Instead, it says that continuity through change is the real constant. To follow this is to be free from the terror of endings, For every ending in water is only a movement to another place, another shape, another chance to flow. And so in the deep hours, the image of water remains, soft, patient, unbroken, not because it refuses to meet what is hard, but because it knows it has no need to struggle. The hard breaks itself, the soft simply endures, and in the end, it is endurance that shapes the world. The mind drifts further into the dim corridors of thought, where the sound of water becomes not only a sound, but a presence, a reminder that all things move toward transformation. Lao Tzu's vision of water is not simply a poetic device, but a framework for living, a method of aligning with the inevitable rather than opposing it. In his teaching, the soft conquers the hard because the soft refuses the single moment of victory. It plays instead for the endless game, where time is the true ally. Stone may resist for years, even centuries, but water's persistence is a promise that cannot be broken. The lesson moves quietly into the heart. One does not have to win today to shape tomorrow. This is the art of slow triumph, the patience that outlives resistance by outlasting it. And yet, water is not only patient, it is deliberate. Every curve of a river's path is the result of countless decisions, some swift, some subtle, made by its own flowing body as it meets the contours of the world. It does not argue with the cliff, it turns. It does not curse the fallen tree, it passes beneath. It does not resent the drought, it waits in the cool earth until the rains return. To live as water is to become untroubled by the need to control the form of the path, for the path is never truly fixed. The strength is in the movement itself, in refusing to become still out of fear of change. And in this refusal, there is a deeper truth, that surrender is not always loss, and control is not always gain. By yielding, water gains access to every space. By insisting on its shape, it would lose most. In the human spirit, this becomes the practice of entering situations with openness rather than rigidity, allowing oneself to be shaped by the experience without being consumed by it. Yet water's humility hides its immense capacity for power. It may begin as a trickle, gentle enough to pass unnoticed, but with time it gathers, it swells, it becomes a current that can sweep away what once seemed immovable. This is why the sage values the low ground. There, in the place where nothing seeks to stand tall, all things eventually meet. The low ground is the meeting point of rivers, the resting place of rain, the foundation upon which the mountains drain themselves. In human life, the low ground is found in listening, in observation, in the quiet taking in of what others offer without immediate need to respond or display. This gathering is not passive, it is preparation. For when the moment comes to act, one acts from abundance rather than emptiness. The sea is the king of streams because it lies beneath them, Lao Tzu writes. To lie beneath is to choose the position of reception rather than dominance, to let others come of their own will. This is the power of the one who does not chase but attracts, who does not demand loyalty but inspires it. And still, there is a gentleness that remains unbroken even in water's greatest force. The waves that batter the shore also carry life to it. The flood that reshapes the land leaves behind fertile soil. In the human soul, the equivalent is a firmness of principle that does not lose kindness, an ability to stand without cruelty. To be like water is to refuse the belief that one must harm to remain strong. There is also the teaching of reflection. Clear water mirrors the world without holding it, and in this, it teaches detachment. The sky's passing clouds, the moon's changing face, the faces of those who stand at the bank, all are held for a moment, then released. So should the mind hold its experiences, seen, known, and then allowed to pass without binding them to the self. This is not forgetfulness, but freedom from possession. And perhaps the most subtle teaching of water is its acceptance of cycles. It evaporates into the unseen sky, becomes cloud, returns as rain, gathers again into streams, never fearing that leaving its current form is the end. In human life, every loss is a change of form, every ending a return to another beginning. The sage does not cling to what must transform, for the same river is never the same river, yet it is always the river. The night grows deeper still, and the flow of thought becomes indistinguishable from the flow of water itself, quiet, steady, certain that it will continue long after the listener's eyes close and the dream begins. In the stillness of thought, water becomes not only an element, but a principle that reaches into the core of human conduct. Lao Tzu saw in its quiet endurance a truth that words often fail to hold. The world is not conquered by those who push hardest, but by those who cannot be pushed aside. The stone resists once, twice, perhaps 100 times, but resistance is finite. Endurance has no such limit. Water does not exhaust itself in the act of overcoming. It overcomes by continuing. And in that continuation lies a subtle form of wisdom, one that does not see victory as a single, shining moment, but as a quiet inevitability that unfolds without the noise of battle. This is why the sage learns to value time as a companion rather than an enemy. Time, like water, wears down all that is fixed and unbending, but it also nourishes all that is willing to grow. To be in harmony with time is to refuse the false urgency of forcing outcomes before they are ready, to understand that the ripest fruit will fall without effort, that the seed beneath the soil already knows its way upward. Yet water's teaching is not passivity. It moves, always moves, shaping the land, feeding the roots, carrying life from one place to another. Even when it appears still, there is movement beneath, currents invisible to the eye, but strong enough to shift the bed of the river. So it is with the inner life. The most profound transformations often occur in the depths, where no one is looking. To cultivate such depth is to live without needing the constant approval of the surface world, to find strength in the unseen work that will, in time, emerge naturally. In this, water teaches the discipline of self-containment. It does not boast of where it has been or where it will go. It simply flows toward its purpose. And purpose for water is not a fixed point but a state of being. The river does not dream of the sea, it moves toward it because that is what it is. In human terms, this is to act in accordance with one's nature, not in pursuit of an image or reward. When action is aligned with nature, there is no exhaustion from pretending, no weariness from holding a shape that is not one's own. Water's humility is another part of its strength. It does not seek the highest place but finds the lowest, not out of shame, but because the lowest place is the gathering place. There streams unite. There life thrives. Lao Tzu saw that a ruler who holds himself low becomes the meeting point for his people, and a person who lowers pride becomes a friend to all. Humility is not weakness but access. It is the opening through which all things may pass. In the way of water, pride is a dam, and humility the open channel. And water's patience is not without its moments of sudden transformation. There are times when a river swells into a flood, when the quiet accumulation becomes an unstoppable surge. In life, this is the moment when long preparation meets the right conditions, when years of quiet work produce a single, undeniable movement. The flood is not reckless, it is the release of what was already stored. And when the force is spent, water returns to stillness, without regret for its brief display of power. This is a strength rare in the world, knowing when to act with full force and when to return to the quiet flow. Water also teaches transparency. It holds no secrets for itself, yet it conceals depths to those who look without truly seeing. In its clarity, it reflects the world faithfully. In its depth, it holds mysteries. This is the balance the sage seeks: openness without vulnerability to harm, depth without the need for display. And perhaps the most comforting of water's lessons is its inevitability. It will reach the sea, whether in days or decades, whether as a river, a stream, or a cloud returning as rain. There is no doubt in its journey, only the calm certainty of arrival. For a human life, this is the trust that one's path, if walked with constancy, will arrive where it must, without the strain of forcing each step. The night listens to these truths as a sleeper listens to the rain, not needing to grasp each drop, only to feel the rhythm that has no beginning and no end. And in that rhythm, the soul finds its own reflection, soft, patient, enduring. There is an ancient scene, imagined yet true, in which Lao Tzu sits by the edge of a slow-moving stream, his robes gathered loosely, the air scented with pine, and the quiet sweetness of distant blossoms. He does not speak at first, for the water is already teaching, and he listens as one listens to an elder. The stream glides past, carrying leaves that turn in gentle spirals, their movements directed not by will, but by the unhurried certainty of the current. Here he observes what many fail to see. Water does not compete, yet nothing can rival its persistence. It does not shout, yet its voice is heard by mountains and valleys alike. It does not resist, yet its path cannot be stopped. This is not only poetry, it is instruction for the human spirit. Life often presses the mind to harden, to defend, to meet force with greater force. But Lao Tzu's water reveals that the greater mastery is in avoiding the trap of direct collision. When the path is blocked, water bends. When confined, it finds the smallest opening. When pressed downward, it gains momentum. When lifted to the sky, it waits until it can fall again. In this lies the art of transforming what is given into what is needed. The sage learns to make use of the obstacles, to see in each constraint the chance to move differently, to let the shape of the challenge guide the shape of the response. And yet, water's way is not an excuse for inaction. Its patience is active. It is a patience that never ceases to work. Even the smallest drip, allowed enough time, can pierce stone. Even the gentlest wave, given enough repetition, can alter the shape of the shore. This is a reminder that progress is not always visible in the moment, that the most enduring changes are often invisible until they are complete. The heart that adopts water's pace learns not to demand immediate results, for it understands that the present moment is only a fragment of the whole journey. The mind too can be like a river, clear when it allows thought to flow freely, muddy when it clings to what it should release. When the mind is clear, it reflects truth without distortion, like still water beneath a moonlit sky. When agitated, it loses its depth, and even the brightest light cannot be seen within it. Thus, to live like water is to cultivate a calm within, not as a withdrawal from life, but as a condition for engaging with it fully. This calm is not broken by passing storms, for storms too are part of the great cycle. They churn the surface but cannot reach the deep currents below. Lao Tzu's teachings suggest that the soul should live in those deeper currents, steady and untroubled, letting the surface do as it must. There is also a quiet nobility in the way water nourishes without seeking recognition. It gives itself to roots and seeds without claiming ownership of the growth. It refreshes the weary without asking for thanks. In this, water becomes a model for generosity, offering without expectation, aiding without claiming credit. True virtue, in Lao Tzu's vision, is like this: unseen, unrecorded, yet essential to all life. And still, the paradox remains that water's gentleness is the very source of its strength. The sword is proud of its sharpness, but it dulls. The rock boasts of its weight, but it crumbles. The fire burns brightly, but it consumes itself. Water endures because it does not insist on being what it is not. It does not oppose the truth of its own nature. In this, there is a profound invitation to self-acceptance, to live in a way that does not fight one's essence, to be shaped without losing the core of who one is. And perhaps most profound of all is water's lesson of return. No matter how far it travels, it is always on its way back to the sea, its vast home where all rivers meet. In the same way, the human spirit, through countless changes of form and place, moves toward its own vastness, its own unbroken source. There is comfort in knowing that no detour is wasted, no delay permanent. All that moves with sincerity arrives. And so the night holds this thought as the stream outside continues its endless journey, whispering to the stones, to the trees, to the one who listens in stillness, that the way forward is not in force, but in flow, not in holding on, but in letting go, not in speed, but in the certainty of return. In the quiet reach of night, the image of water deepens into a mirror for the human soul, showing that softness is not the absence of power, but its most enduring form. Lao Tzu understood this in a way that was more than metaphor. He saw it in the valleys where rivers had carved their way through ancient stone, in the delicate persistence of rain that, drop by drop, reshaped the face of the earth. The lesson was clear. What yields can also prevail. What bends can outlast what refuses to move. This truth unsettles the mind, trained to think in terms of dominance, of winning by strength alone, for it suggests that victory can be silent, almost invisible, and still absolute. The sage sees in this not a contradiction, but a deeper harmony, a reminder that power and gentleness are not enemies. To live like water is to resist the temptation to meet every challenge with direct opposition. It is to understand that the straightest line is not always the best path, that sometimes the way forward is found by flowing around the obstacle rather than breaking it apart. Water knows no impatience. It does not rush to overcome, nor does it despair when blocked. Instead, it trusts the quiet mathematics of time, the slow inevitability of its nature. And time for water is not an adversary, but a companion. In human life, this translates to an acceptance that not all things can or should be forced into the present moment, that some transformations can only be completed through the unhurried accumulation of days and seasons. Yet water is never still in its essence. Even in the calmest pool, there are movements too subtle for the eye to catch. Tiny currents shifting, life sustained below the surface. This hidden activity is a reminder that patience is not idleness, that stillness can contain its own quiet work. For the one who listens, this suggests a way of living in which effort is steady and continuous, but never frantic, where change is pursued without the strain of desperation. Water also teaches humility by seeking the lowest places, not out of shame, but because these are the gathering places, the points where streams unite. Lao Tzu knew that a person who can dwell in humility becomes a point of connection, a meeting ground for others, a source of nourishment and support. Pride stands apart and alone. Humility gathers and multiplies. In this way, lowering oneself becomes a form of strength, a way of holding more rather than less. And water's humility is not weakness, for it can rise as vapor, move with the wind, fall again as rain. It is always willing to change its form, to adapt without losing its essence. In human terms, this is the courage to let go of rigid identities, to allow oneself to be shaped by circumstances without being broken by them. Such adaptability is not a betrayal of self, but a return to the core of one's nature. For just as water is water, whether in river, cloud or snow, a person remains themselves through all transformations if they remain true to their essence. Water also holds the lesson of clarity. A clear stream reflects the sky perfectly, but when stirred by violence, it becomes opaque, its depths hidden. So too the mind, which can only reflect truth when it is calm. Anger, fear, and agitation cloud it, making even the simplest truths difficult to see. To live like water is to cultivate a mind that clears quickly, that allows disturbances to pass through without clinging to them. Such clarity is not constant perfection, it is the ability to return to transparency again and again. And in the moments when water swells into flood, when its force is suddenly visible, and irresistible, it shows that gentleness does not mean weakness, that patience does not mean passivity. When the conditions are right, when the moment has ripened, water moves with unstoppable force, sweeping away what was thought immovable. The wise person too knows when to act decisively after long preparation, when to let stored potential become a single, transformative act. Yet when the surge is over, water returns to its quiet flow, without clinging to its moment of power, without seeking to preserve it. This is the rhythm of life well lived, times of stillness, times of movement, each with their place, each flowing naturally into the other. And so in the dim candlelight, the lesson of water becomes more than words. It becomes a presence, a way of breathing and being. It asks nothing, demands nothing, only invites the listener to soften, to endure, to flow, to trust that the path will lead where it must, not through force, but through the inevitability of what cannot be stopped. In this, the heart begins to understand what the mountains have always known, that even the hardest stone must one day bow to the gentlest touch, repeated without end. The moon hangs low over the still surface of a hidden lake, silver lights scattered across the ripples where a breeze has touched the water and moved on. In this quiet, Lao Tzu's thought takes shape, not as a rigid doctrine, but as something living, flowing, breathing. Water is his teacher, his metaphor, his mirror. In its patience, he sees the futility of haste. In its humility, he sees the power of yielding. And in its unbroken persistence, he sees the inevitability of transformation. The mountains believe themselves eternal, yet the streams carve their faces with patient hands. The walls built by human ambition crumble where rain seeps into their smallest cracks. Time favours the gentle, not because it is sentimental, but because gentleness works in harmony with its long cycles, never exhausting itself in the illusion of control. A person who understands this no longer measures progress in sudden victories, but in the subtle shifts that unfold quietly and without announcement. Water teaches that one need not always push forward. Sometimes it is wiser to wait, to let the terrain reveal its openings, to let gravity do the work. And yet this waiting is not the waiting of passivity. It is the waiting of a seed before spring, alive with hidden growth. Even the softest drop wears away the stone, not by force but by returning, again and again, unchanged in its intent. Lao Tzu saw that a life lived in such a way becomes unshakable. No insult can wound it deeply, for it flows past. No obstacle can hold it forever, for it finds another way. No loss can destroy it, for it knows the sea awaits at the end of every journey. This way of being is neither resistance nor surrender, but a deeper synthesis where one chooses the form of surrender that becomes its own kind of resistance. In the stillness of water, there is also a lesson about reflection. When undisturbed, it reveals what stands above it with perfect clarity. The human mind too is capable of such clarity, but only when it is allowed to settle, when the storms of emotion have been given time to pass. Clarity cannot be forced. It arrives naturally when the agitation is released. To see truly, one must learn to let the sediment of thought sink to the depths until the surface shines like a mirror. And yet water is not afraid to be stirred, for it knows the sediment will settle again. There is no fear of change in its nature, no desperate clinging to form. A river is not less itself when it becomes mist, nor when the mist becomes rain. The essence remains even as the shape shifts. This is the freedom that comes from self-knowledge, the understanding that identity is not bound to one moment, one role, one appearance. When the mind adopts this fluidity, life's transitions no longer appear as threats but as natural phases of the same unbroken current. In its giving, water teaches a final quiet truth. It nourishes without discrimination, flowing equally to the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the decayed. It asks for nothing in return. This is the highest form of generosity, one that gives not because of obligation or desire for recognition, but because giving is simply its way of being. A life shaped in this image finds its own fulfillment in the act itself, not in the reward. The candle on the low table flickers as a breath of night air slips into the room, and the listener can almost hear the voice of that ancient sage. Not as a command, but as a suggestion. Be like water. Let strength be hidden within gentleness. Let movement be guided by the path that opens before you. Let your persistence be so natural that even you forget you're enduring. When the world becomes hard and unyielding, do not try to match it blow for blow. Flow into the spaces it leaves unguarded. And when joy or sorrow rise suddenly like a flood, let them pass without grasping. Return to your calm channel, to the deep and steady current that cannot be seen from the surface. In this way, the heart learns not only to survive but to prevail, not by winning but by outlasting, not by dominating but by transforming. For in the end, all things return to the sea, and the sea waits for nothing yet receives everything.